things that I will take credit for is really bringing safety to the forefront. But I will also smack myself upside the head because being on the forefront is different than actually being actionable. And what I mean is we can talk safety, but living safety is much different than that. So when we look at, safety really isn't about other people, it's about you. And if everybody thinks of safety from a personal standpoint and take personal accountability for one's own safety, then we all would be that much better. Rather than there just be lip service for safety, we have to develop an action plan for ourselves. And we think about the things that can come up and the things that we can do to sort of prepare for them. And just some forethought for potential hazardous situations can go a long way. So as we think about the current, as we approach storm season and tornadoes, clearly the planet is not happy. So we can expect more hazardous weather conditions. So as we think about tornadoes, we can think about where in your house is a good spot. If you have a basement, in the basement. Southwest corner of the basement, preferably. If without a basement, as interior as much as you can be in, if you have a bathtub in there. And if you can cover yourself, cover yourself. And if you have a hard hat, put it on. Seems kind of like not that big a deal, but it is really a big deal. So one of the things, as we end this current board year in the committee, and I'll be pushing it from the board table since I've been reelected, is really from a safety standpoint. Safety messages are awesome, but making them more livable. And what are we really doing? So when I say that, we have resource officers. We have other people that are not responsible for safety for ourselves, but have a heightened awareness of safety, even for the buildings that they're within. So what we need to do is just say, what do you need to do to be the most successful in conveying the safety needs for every building? So I just wanted to state that because I could do a safety message and go over something that is pertinent, but it would be just a message, and what we ultimately have to do is take more ownership. Even from the standpoint of, we think about driving, and I will wrap this up here quickly, but we think about driving, and all too often you see people get into their cars, and if they don't know exactly where they're going, they take off. Then they put the seatbelt on, and then they're adjusting radio and the climate controls, and then they grab their phone and put in directions and all of that, when all of that could have taken place before they even moved. That would be inherently more safer for themselves. Even as we see people walking with their phones, not paying attention, going downstairs. Just today heard about a gentleman going downstairs, stumbled, tripped, and fell, ultimately broke his neck and died. They don't know that it was ultimately because he was by himself, and it was at the end of the workday by himself. But at the bottom of the stairs, the phone was activated, so could it have come out? It could have come out, but it wasn't like it was in a off mode or anything. So just some of those things that we have to think about from a personal safety standpoint. Any comments or questions? All right. Next, is there a motion to adopt the April 2021 Finance, Buildings, and Ground Committee agenda? All right, and we're all unanimous with the agenda that we have. Next item is presentation of the fiscal 2021 year-to-date financials for February and March, and look to move to the full board for approval. Mr. McCray.
Thank you very much. And as noted, the February and March financials are included in the committee packet. And as seems to happen every month, there's really nothing all that exciting. A couple key points, though. As we move into, we'll say, this last quarter of the fiscal year is when we'll really begin to see how we're going to finish the fiscal year. Right. And so the board has made a commitment to Fund 73, Fund 46. Again, Fund 73 is the other post-employment benefit fund. We have roughly a $2 million obligation that we need to make annually. We don't have to make, but then we're not funding the fund. And so it's good to fund the fund relative to our post-retirement benefits. Secondly, Fund 46 is our capital maintenance fund. And so the district's done a very, very admirable job in making a commitment to that fund. So those are usually the considerations. This year, as the committee knows, right, as I'm sure the whole board knows, perhaps the community knows, it's an interesting fiscal year. We may be down in certain areas, we may be over in other areas. And then two, because we have ESSER 1 funding, what the Business Services Department is in the process of is we anticipated a much higher bill relative to our online learning program via Arise Virtual Academy. All right, so when we submit the grant application, we did so at a much higher value. That invoice has come in less, particularly for the first semester. Right, originally the invoice came in at roughly $960,000. All right, it was reevaluated. All right, and the invoice is less than $400,000. All right, so that's good for us. All right, and so kudos to Business Services for bird dogging that particular invoice. But again, we know we're going to spend X. Most likely it'll come in at Y being much lower. So then that frees up dollars within ESSER 1 to which there are costs incurred out of the general fund relative to our response to the pandemic. So we will then provide a budget adjustment via WISE grants. All right, and work through that process. And once that budget adjustment is approved, then we begin to make those adjustments within Skyward. So what did I say other than, there's a lot of moving chess pieces on the board, but we're still very much in tune to the game. The other thing of note is when you look at March and you look at our cash position, all right, so keep in mind we're, if you will, kind of on the tail end of a lot of our tax settlements, all right, and we have a very substantial equalization aid payment that comes in, all right, but things will start to get much leaner as we go through April into the first part of June until about the middle of June we'll receive that last equalization payment. Okay, also keep in mind, right, and you've gone through this several times, is we'll build a receivable for taxes due, all right, that we'll receive after the conclusion of our fiscal year, all right? So it's April, we're really beginning to kind of wind down. We've asked our buildings to begin to really stop spending their money other than for things such as feeding the rabbits, the clay unit for pottery in that third week of May, right? We still need to continue to purchase things, but we're really purchasing things, if you will, for those last few weeks of school. We're not stockpiling. All right, that's my Sisyphean task, right, of preventing people from stockpiling. But we're in a good financial position. That's really the summation, but to also kind of clue you in a little bit, or remind you, I should say, in terms of as we begin to look to this next few months of our fiscal year.
Questions for Mr. McCray? Commissioner Myers.
And so you said that the bill for the virtual stuff came in significantly less. Right?
Correct.
Do you know why? I'm glad it worked in our favor, but
it did. Well, yes. And so we knew the online virtual academy, right? And so Tammy will chime in. So again, welcome Tammy Carlson, who's our grant manager, right, for the district. So if I miss something. So we know the migration of students, and the migration of students from essentially our traditional bricks and mortar to Arise Virtual Academy. All right, so they're doing the Arise Virtual Academy, if you will, curriculum. So we work with Wisconsin eSchool Network, all right, with them partners with Florida Virtual Academy. All right, so those are two partners to provide both instruction and curriculum above what we can provide in terms of instruction. Sometimes we throw staff into the mix that helps us on a reduced rate. All right, so if I haven't, you're all very bright, right? But this is not very exciting stuff unless you're in a business office. So we anticipated a high cost. So first semester, second semester. All right, first semester bill comes in, it's 900 and some thousand. We're like, whoa. That's a little higher than what we were thinking. All right. And so, again, part of the issue is traditionally we have probably under 200 students in a rise, right? We balloon to almost 10 times that amount. All right. And so there's a lot of paradigms in terms of what Wisconsin eSchool Network is providing for data to support. There's a lot of drop in ads because you may recall, right, we had folks kind of trying and then saying, no, I want to go back to bricks and mortar, or I want another educational opportunity. We have some who are in bricks and mortar, and no, we want to jump to a Rise Virtual Academy. So a lot of flux. And so long story short, I think there was, if you will, some growing pains with eSchool Network in Florida, all right, in terms of tracking, in terms of billing, applying the appropriate coding. So when we got the invoice for $900, we're like, can you go back and double check, right? And so they went back, they recalculated everything. Then there were subsequent conversations of, okay, show us the calculation. And I'll give you an example. In the business office, we don't necessarily see drop in ads, right? Because not only do we have drop in ads within our own student population relative to PowerSchool, we have drop in ads relative to AVA and their engagement in the online learning. All right, so trying to reconcile all of that. Well, we didn't have data other than our own PowerSchool data. And again, PowerSchool, our student management software. Infinite Campus. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that life ring. Sorry, PowerSchool, Infinite Campus, Skyward, the student management software. So again, long story short, and I'll try to make it even more brief, is they went back, they sharpened their pencils. We were then, and they did their thing, but we also gained access to their database. So we can see what's being inputted, right? When Tammy Carlson dropped, when did Tammy Carlson add? When did she drop? Did she drop within the allowable time frame? Because most likely, right, it's a lot of money. And when we go through our single audit process, all right, what's the backup for the invoice? How did the company arrive at that calculation? We can essentially, should it be inquired by the auditor, show them kind of behind the scenes data. All right. And so, Greg said this earlier, it's not to necessarily toot my own horn, but there's no way on God's green earth I'm signing off on a $960,000 invoice without backup. I enjoy being here. All right. So again, Tammy, certainly Dave Parr, the group at AVA, and certainly, Jamie in her capacity, we kind of all got together and really worked through that issue, a couple online meetings, and that's how we arrive at a lesser invoice versus just rubber stamping and moving it on.
Dan, you'd mentioned the ESSER funding, ESSER 1 funding. So what can that be used for then?
So ESSER 1, may I ask you hold that question until we get to the budget? Okay. All right, you bet. Thank you.
So as we are sitting here now, do we have a wild projection of the millions of dollars we'll have left over at the end of the year? Wild projection.
No.
Okay.
Okay, I will always play my cards very closely when it comes to a year-end projection, particularly in April. So
I will always give you an opportunity to play those cards if I can. Okay, thank you.
I move that we move this on to the full board.
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second, and I also agree. That would be the committee, so that passes unanimously. Next item, 2021-22 Budget Development Update. Mr. McCray. go back. Update on capital maintenance projects. Mr. Leader.
Thank you. So as you may recall at our last meeting, I had that Craig's North storefront door come in and it had the wrong colored hardware on it. Well, we received the new hardware and that door is presently installed. That happened over spring break, so that's one project off the list. The remaining two projects I have are one is the dehumidification system at Marshall Middle School, which is scheduled for June. And then I have the exterior brickwork at Parker High School that needs to be replaced, and that's going to happen over June as well. So that'll kind of round out the capital projects for 2021. Moving on to Safe Pathways. Yesterday we held a subcontractor walkthrough at all of our first phase pathway buildings. Went quite well. Bids are due on Thursday, April 29th. So everything is speeding along quite nicely. So we should have we will have bids in on the 29th. And then today, Dan and I spoke with interior designer, went over some interior finishes, chose flooring, whether it's rubber, vinyl, VCT, walk-off type carpeting and stuff like that for all the 6 buildings. So we're moving right along.
Just as a reminder, which are those 6?
We've got Adams, Washington, Harrison, Van Buren. Did I say Washington? I did say Washington. And help me out, Dan.
Jefferson and Lincoln.
Thank you, Jefferson.
There you
Lincoln.
go.
Any questions for Mr. Leader?
And if I may add one more thing.
Sure, absolutely.
Commissioner Myers, you did ask for a more detailed list of the capital projects. As soon as these 2 buildings are finished, Parker and Marshall, then I'd like to provide that to the committee. You bet.
Okay. Next item, which I was trying to get there sooner. The 2021-22 budget development update.
Thanks, Patrick. So not only did this time of the year, if you will, we receive a report from Mr. Garner and his team relative to the staffing. Staffing is huge for us because it's 80% of our budget. Right. So once we get that settled, then we can go ahead and really begin to refine the elements of the budget. So most likely you'll get a very, very detailed update at our next meeting in May. As we just kind of continue to work through that. It's our intent as business services to really bring forth a kind of, if you will, preliminary budget, a forecast, certainly come summertime, right? So we'll know a lot more. And just to recap, right, we get our aid statement, our preliminary aid statement on July 1st. And so that really probably in that month of July is where we'll have a fairly good understanding. Now, again, I alluded to earlier, I like to play my cards because as everyone here knows, right, so you get a preliminary aid statement in July. You're finishing, if you will, your preliminary field work in July. You have your final field work yet to come in August. You have your aid certification, which is essentially identifying to the state for what you'll finally be aided on in August. But that aid doesn't come until October. And then, of course, September is our third Friday count. All right. And if there's anything, if you will, that makes me really nervous, it's our membership count. All right. So you may recall as part of the budget assumption, I believe off the top of my head, I think we assume 9,065 members. And again, members, if you will, are kind of belly buttons. They're not enrollment because enrollment also captures open enrollment students coming into our district. All right. So I think as we move forward, right, and so you'll keep in mind that Allison DeGraff and her team, and I think Patrick obviously is part of this, is kind of done, if you will, a preliminary survey in terms of who's interested in a RISE Virtual Academy. And then, really trying for us to understand prior to registration where we believe students will be landing. All right. That really helps, again, drive not only the staffing report, all right, but I also want to pause there and say the numbers used in staffing are different than the numbers we'll be using on the fiscal side. All right. Now, staffing is fiscal. All right, but there's a very fine line that we have to walk in terms of understanding the difference between the two. It's not unlike understanding the difference between membership and enrollment. All right, they're all students, all right, but they're two very different terms. One thing, and certainly Frank Schultz wrote an interesting article recently in the Gazette Extra. That's one of the reasons I asked Tammy to kind of come and join me, is it's relative to ESSER funding. Okay, so as one would say, or perhaps hearing the news or at a neighbor, or at the grocery store or the bowling alley, you guys are going to be swimming in cash, right? Well, the reality is yes, okay, we are going to be the recipients of ESSER 1, which we are currently in and using, ESSER 2, ESSER 3, and I forgot when I go back to ESSER 1, we have the gear. So at your desk side, right, is kind of a memo that you received in February, but I've updated it to include a little bit more on 2, a little bit more on 3. Okay, so back to Commissioner Millard's question, what did we spend ESSER 1 on, or what are we spending ESSER 1 on? All right, and again, we have until next September of 22 for ESSER 1, but as noted in the memo, we're trying to wrap that up and be done fiscally by June 30th. A portion of ESSER 1, all right, is also a private school, all right, component to that. But here for us, what we've used it on is a lot of PPE, a lot of additional cleaning chemicals, all right, some equipment, all right, and staffing in particular to Arise Virtual Academy, right, because we want to keep class size low, all right, in our buildings, our bricks and mortar buildings. So we ramped up our staffing and covered it with ESSER funding at Arise Virtual Academy. Because when you have 2,000 students, now I think maybe around 1,600, right, and in AVA now, because it's semester, we had a migration back to our buildings, all right, is you still have to have staff, paraprofessionals working with students at Arise Virtual Academy, right, as well as certainly certified staff members in Arise Virtual Academy. So Commissioner Millard, that's what we spent a bulk of that money on. All right. We do not get to spend it on, if you will, day-to-day operations. We can't pay utility bill with it. We can't pay the CFO's salary with it. We certainly can't afford to pay Mr. Leader's salary. All right. So I just want to throw that out there. Right. So it's really specific to the grant guidelines as determined by ESSER. Similarly, ESSER 2 comes along. All right. Now, there's not a private school partnership that we're responsible for in ESSER 2. All right, so that's kind of good. All right, and it's good simply because it's a little less of an administrative headache for us. All right, but they're still bound, if you will, all right, because ESSER 2, like ESSER 1 and like ESSER 3, is like a title program. So the governance of title, all right, so still has implications to our public school system. All right, and what I mean by that is in ESSER 1, a school may have gone out and purchased an item. At the conclusion of that grant, all right, that item comes back to the district. Okay, now ESSER 2, and Tammy will correct me if I'm wrong, while we're not the fiscal agent for ESSER 2 relative to our private school partners, if our private school partners go out and purchase a particular item, at the conclusion of ESSER 2,
No, that's actually incorrect.
that's incorrect. Okay, good. That's why you're here.
Yep. So actually for ESSER 2 and
For ESSER 2 and 3, those programs are actually being managed by the state Department of Public Instruction. They've actually contracted out with a partner to manage those programs, and they have very limited items that can be purchased with those funds. And there's a process, and it's all handled at the state level. So we are not involved in that process at all as a school district for the private school pieces. But Dan is correct. With ESSER 1, if they purchased, technology is mostly what the private schools purchased, although there were some things like picnic tables, some sprayers. If the items that they purchased can be utilized for a different program under Title II, Title I, Title III, Title IV, then they can transition those items over to those programs. But if they're not an allowable item under one of those programs, they do need to get returned to the district. So we have a process in place to manage the inventory for those types of things so that at the end of the grant period in 2022, we can handle that process.
Thanks. So real quick, we're going to try to breeze through this. In the memo, particularly on page 2, you kind of see we outlined some steps. All right. Now, they're not all necessarily one right after the other. Some of them are sequential. All right. But one of it is we're awarded a dollar value grant, ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. We don't get a check from the state. We don't get a check from the federal government. We have to go through what's known as WISE grants, and that's the portal that I have pulled up here. This is where Tammy lives the majority of her life. Skyward and WISE grants, Skyward being our financial platform. All right, and so WISE grants, again, being that portal, is the portal has to open, and that's what we apply for the grant funds for. And the grant funds have to meet criteria that essentially, if you will, is kind of drop downs within the portal. All right, then we submit that application, and then it's reviewed by a member of the Department of Public Instruction team. And then it's either approved, rejected, or more question and information is needed. And then we go back and we provide that information, and hopefully that information meets the satisfaction of the reviewer, and then the grant is finally approved. So the grant's approved. Then, if you will, we almost upload that grant value and confirm it within Skyward, which is our financial software. That's what we use for our requisitioning. All right, then great. Something goes through, the grant's going on, we're exercising the intent of the grant. Maybe that's, addressing learning loss, maybe it's a mental health program, maybe it's buying PPE or additional cleaning supplies, right? All of that stuff is going on, and we're incurring those expenses, and cash is going out the door. And then at the end of a reporting period, particularly on a month, right, Tammy will run her Skyward report, make sure everything fits together nicely, and then submits a grant claim. All right, then we wait a little bit, and then we get the cash. All right, so that's a little bit of the process. It's not like winning the lottery. Go in, turn your ticket, get your cash, and go home. So it's a little more involved than that, right? And people, if you will, on the outside don't necessarily understand that, right? And so if you would be kind enough to be our ambassadors and say, yeah, it's not the lottery ticket. We have to work, we have to prove. And I've not even addressed, if you will, kind of the reporting mechanism in terms of, did you satisfactorily complete the grant? All right, meaning you have to report. Annually, we have to report on Title I, right? Were learning objectives met? And so on and so forth, right? So real quick, if you don't have any questions, this is kind of, again, WISE grants. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I didn't realize I'd put my hand up that. Okay, so they all go toward different things. So ESSER 2, it says here that goes toward preparedness in response to COVID, and outreach and services to special populations. Can you give me an indication as to what that means specifically?
Well, there it is, the rub, right?
We don't know yet.
Of how do we define that?
Okay.
Right. So, and again, I probably should let Tammy talk, right? But, it's a great 30,000 foot guideline.
Okay.
But how do we operationalize that?
Do we define what the special population is? I can't imagine that they let us do that.
Well, so special populations are your EL populations, your homeless students, your at-risk students, your minority students. So they do have a definition. And if you pull up the GEPA, Dan, do you know how to get to the GEPA?
I don't know how to. Do you want to drive?
Yeah. So if you go to we actually have to sign a document called a GEPA document that identifies that we are going to make sure that our special populations are being handled correctly. And we actually had to sign it this fiscal year, so it's gonna be in this, that's why you couldn't find it.
Plus, I can't really read that screen.
It's pretty small.
Oh, this is you. I don't know if you have access to it. Here we go. Don't we love technology? Now, where is the increase? There we go. Because I don't know about you guys, but I can't read that. Okay. So. I was pretty sure. I do apologize. This is not the form. It basically says you're doing it, but it doesn't identify the specific students. But it is. It's your migrant students, your homeless students, your special education students, your at-risk students, any of your students that would be considered a subgroup that has additional reasons why the pandemic could have affected them adversely. So that's going to be your addressing.
Okay.
And they've clarified that when you create a program, if students who are not considered part of that at-risk population are also serviced by that program, that is fine. It's just that you need to make sure that you are targeting those special populations to make sure that anything that is addressing that learning loss or addressing issues that they may have come across, homeless, especially special education students who may have had challenges with the learning methods that were offered. So those are the different types of areas.
And so there's a little bit of overlap with ESSER 3 then, right? It's a kind of a continuation of some of that.
Well, actually, you
Isn't
can
it?
use the funding for all three. The same funds that you can do the same types of projects for all three, but they each have a more specific focus that the law intended for the money to be used for. Like ESSER 3 has a requirement that 20% of the allocation is actually used for addressing learning
I see.
loss.
I see.
So even though in ESSER 3, you're still going to be able to do the same types of things that you can do in ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, the focus that the federal government wants for that ESSER 3 funding is to address that learning loss, which is why they put that 20% requirement in.
Okay.
But when we're looking at WISE grants here, the pull-down menus for ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 are very similar. So they're going to definitely be very, you can do pretty much the same things, but your focus, what they want you to focus on is slightly different for each
Okay.
of those.
And I know they all have different expiration dates,
Correct.
which is great. But does that mean that the money is distributed at different times, or does this come as a lump sum?
Yep. So we, like Dan said, we don't get the money
Until we apply.
right away. So what happens is when we are looking here. So what happens is, ESSER 1 is right here, elementary and secondary emergency relief fund. We were allocated $2 million, $2,119,000. Once again, that's shared with the private schools.
Right.
That $2 million is for the entire period of the grant.
Okay.
So even though if you look up here, it says it's 2021 school year, that actually covers through the September of 2022.
Okay.
So this $2 million. We what happens is they say, we are setting aside $2 million for the Janesville School District. But you don't actually get that money until you put your budget in, you spend the money,
Right.
you file the claim, we check the claim, does it match your budget? Is everything okay? Then we say, yep, we'll pay you, and then 10 days later you get paid.
Okay.
So and so that's each of those. So ESSER 1 has been out for a while now. We're fairly close to getting the public school. We'll probably have the private school. We'll pretty much be done with the public school by the end of this fiscal year. Private schools will probably take, just because there's some challenges with working with the private schools and making sure that they get what they need. There was some challenges with the way that their money was allocated, so they didn't actually get access to their money right as quickly as we did during this first batch, because there was some issues with which dollar amounts were needed to be used for the private allocation. It's about 4% for ESSER and GEAR. But the public is going to be done. So ESSER 2, which is going to be housed in the 21-22 school year, even though it goes till 2023, is our $7.4 million.
Okay.
And once again, it's the federal government is obligating that money to be coming to us through the state of Wisconsin, but we don't actually get $7 million in our bank account today.
Right. We can't start accessing it until the 2021-22 school year?
Nope, actually, we can. This is just where it's being housed.
I
They
see.
opened the application this week,
Okay.
so it just opened. We're working on with our team to make sure that we're making the best decisions possible for this funding, especially since the ESSER 3 funding will be coming as well. And there's some pieces with the ESSER 3 funding requiring that 20% addressing learning losses. There's some ways that we might want to, with the puzzle piece, this funding should go over to this one so that we can get that 20%. This funding goes over here. So there's some pieces as we're working through those processes to make sure that we're putting funding into the correct place. And we can move things around if we find that, we really, like Dan said, we had that private school or the Arise bill that we had thought was going to be close to $900,000 for the full year. It ended up being $300,000, for the first semester. So we're not going to get anywhere close to what we thought. So we were able to move some other things in. So they are flexible. You have to do a budget adjustment.
Mm-hmm.
So they initially approve your application. So Dan asked me to just kind of quick show you what we have to do. So we have 4 different areas: general education, special education, food service, and community service fund. At this point, we are only utilizing the general education, although with ESSER 2 and 3, that might change. So you go into the general education, and then there are these areas. So personnel is going to be your staff people that you pay. Purchase services is when you pay someone to provide you a service. Non-capital objects are items that are under your capitalization threshold of $5,000 that you're purchasing. And then capital objects are above your $5,000. We've never used the insurance piece. And then other objects are basically just dues or fees to outside organizations. So say we were going to be doing a teacher here. So you have to go into the personnel. You have to select which program type. So Jim, this is going to kind of answer your what kind of areas. So it's addressing after school and summer learning. That was not one that was in the ESSER 1, but it is in ESSER 2 and 3. Addressing long-term school closure, educational technology, mental health services and supports, outreach service delivery to special populations, and preparedness in response to COVID-19. So first you have to figure out, well, what we're buying, what of those areas does it fall under? And as you can see, some of those things are, well, we're preparing and responding to COVID-19, but we're also addressing long-term school closure. So which does it fall under? Yeah. So some of it is just getting to know the system, learning the combinations, trying to figure out, they have some budget combinations. So there's a lot of easy things. So let's just say that we're doing our after school and summer learning. So then you have to select what kind of a person are you going to be doing that? Is a teacher going to be doing that? Is a reading specialist? Is just a general support staff? So say we're doing a teacher, because teachers need licensure. So you have to show that you have the appropriate licensure for that. And then you have to select what area. So what are they going to be doing after school? Is it academic and behavior? Is it reading and reading interventions? And then your position activity. And then the neat thing is it kind of tells you, gives you help while you're doing it. So standard default is just basically a general contract. And that's pretty much, if you're going to be actually working with students, the only one that you can actually use. And you have to split the salaries and benefits. You put the general ledger account number as our school district Skyward account number. The FTE is going to be the full-time equivalency in our district for a teaching staff member. That's 1,520 hours is a 1.0 FTE. And then you have to put in their license number. And I'm just going to pick on my daughter's, one of her favorite elementary teachers, Mrs. Werner. Oh, and the system, of course, isn't doing it. So she does not have a reading specialist license.
I see.
So because she does not have a reading specialist license, she can only work up to 0.25 FTE on this position. And that's 380 hours. So if we're having people doing reading and reading interventions and you have some fabulous elementary school teachers that don't have reading specialist licenses, they can only work 380 hours after school through the grant and be paid through the grant. So, and then you have to do a detailed description and there's some other pieces. Each of the sections has a little bit different, but I also wanted to point out to you something in regarding to remodeling, because that has some questions that, and the neat thing is if you know, those are called woofer codes, the numbers here, if you know those, you can kind of put things in. So with remodeling, and then it'll fill it in for you, which is kind of nice. But remodeling, like if we're doing any kind of remodeling with our ESSER money, we have to describe the specifics of the remodeling project and we have to describe how the remodeling is necessary due to the COVID. So each of the different areas has some questions like that. So it's not something that a fiscal person can just sit down and throw some numbers in a budget. And here's your account numbers, here's your numbers. It's also not something that a program person can just say, well, here's the programs we're wanting to do. They need to, because you see there's account numbers that tie with what you're doing. You have to know what area going under. So it really is a group project. And that's what Dan really wanted to point out, that it is something we have to do together as a team, because it's not something that you can have little silos.
Okay. And so I just want to make sure people know that this is not, like you were saying, we don't have a $27 million suddenly in our bank account.
Correct.
That is like a loan of, kind of almost like a credit, like a loan that you get from your,
Like a builder's loan.
a builder's loan or something like that you have access to it and you have to submit stuff in order to get paid for it. And I'm hoping that, because we don't necessarily know all the long-term effects, that we've got time, right? So we're hopefully going to be real judicious about how we spend this money, because some things might come up down the road that we couldn't have anticipated today, or this week when this money first comes available. So
Right, and we do have the option to adjust our budgets at any time during the period.
Okay.
So if we determine that there is something different that we want to put this money toward, then we just have to identify, well, what are we not doing that we thought we were going to do? Or if something comes in under budget, then we can utilize those funds elsewhere. Correct. Yep.
So teaching and learning is really the focus, right? That's where we're working with Allison and her group for instructional loss, right? For also, any mental health supports and things of that nature are really what I think at first we want to identify. Our intent isn't to say, well, woe is us. I think our intent is to say we have to be very thoughtful and purposeful in terms of how we spend the funds. Now, another component is, right, and this is where Mr. Leader comes into play, is are there things on the facility side, right? Because we'll also continue to buy PPE, right? Do we need to, we have some maybe ad hoc plexiglass? Do we need to maybe do things that are a little more permanent? All right. Where are we in terms of, it's not a TPR issue, it's not a teacher pupil ratio per policy issue, but it's really focusing on smaller class size to provide maybe more individualized instruction, right? So that's a component. But sorry, coming back to facilities, right? So I will tell you, there's not a day that goes by that Dave and I and Dave Farwell don't receive an abundance of emails, right, from everyone wanting us to for us to purchase their wares to address what they believe is ESSER funded. All right, companies sometimes skip and go directly to a teacher. Perhaps your district doesn't know. So let us educate you as to why you should buy our product. All right. So, right, exactly. As board members, you get that, right? So if we look to some of the mechanical, and so this is where a little outside budget, but real quick, so thanks for the bird walk, is, good, better, best, right? What is a good solution? Can we afford the best solution? Because again, we have 2.25 million square feet, 20 plus sites. All right, what is the solution? Do we target? Right. So again, what's the thought process behind the decisions, right, that administration will be proposing, whether it's the academic side or the facility side? So that's just, sorry, a long time, far much longer. Sorry for the, I should have asked Denise for more time rather than the 5 minutes on the budget. But we want to tell you a little bit about the operating budget that we normally do every year in debt service, our traditional budget, and then obviously what's going on with ESSER, because that will be a significant component of our budget.
Any questions? Any further questions? By the way, no, I won't do that. One of these times I'm actually going to define what bird walk is, but we have an expert leader leading us on the bird walk. Okay. I did have, since we're still on preliminary budget or budget update, well, and I know last year we were not able to do it, but will we be in position this year to have a reasonable preliminary budget by the end of June? So as a board, we could have I'll call it a preliminary approval at some gross higher level. So we actually start the school year kind of saying, okay, here is not exact, but here is roughly where the budget targets would be.
Yes.
Sweet. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Next is discussion on naming school district facilities and general sponsorships. Mr. McCray.
So I think it was our intent to keep this on the agenda. I know we talked about it at the last meeting. I'm not sure we're going to, if you will, make the sausage tonight, right? But to keep it on the forefront, and perhaps it will warrant some additional administrative time, maybe somewhat of a ad hoc group. Certainly, I defer to Commissioner Ardrey on that. But administratively, I think what we need now is really some clarity. And again, we just are currently, I think today, interviews for the forthcoming athletic director position, right? So what are the board's expectations from a fundraising perspective? Are there sponsorships associated with our facilities? If then, are we naming those facilities after those sponsors? Or are we naming those facilities, if you will, after individuals within the community? Right. And so that's where the clarity, I believe, needs to come in. I mean, again, there's many things to be clear on. That's just an example, right? And so if we read current board policy in terms of naming, all right, most likely everyone in this room could have a potential component of their facility named because we're all upstanding citizens. All right. Is that the intent, or how do we define that? right? And so that's our challenge. So we have a very noble application for naming facilities on my desk. It's been sitting there. I owe an apology letter to the applicant for how long it's been sitting there. I'm probably going to say, well, we've had a little bit of things to deal with in the past number of months, right? But we need to address that. But again, we're also merging, as I shared, we have an AD. We have sponsorships, right? How does all this begin to merge to where it's clean and we can effectively make recommendations and decisions based upon, administrative guidelines and board policy?
So I guess my thoughts on this to further is, do we want to undertake diving into the policy and admin regs associated with this as a committee? Or do we want to look to have, I guess, lack of a better word, a group within, say, the board that takes a deep dive into it and, kind of report back, in essence, to the committee as to how do we want to work through it? I guess, as looked at it and talked with Dan, I wasn't sure the best direction to go at this point, and so looking for ideas.
So my thoughts, and it's kind of the same thing that I was thinking last time when we talked about this a month or so ago. And my concern is, like, I as a board member, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, and right, all of us here could have something named after us because we're all outstanding people. But like, I feel like there might be some not just advantages but pitfalls that I don't see given where I am in this moment. And and also, I mean, let's be honest, I'm not really very associated with the sports stuff in this. I mean, I'm on the board and I care about it, but I don't have kids in the district. I don't have, what I mean? I don't, I didn't raise children in this district. And so I have kind of, to be honest, I have kind of an outsider's look on it. And so I feel like there are things from where I am sitting that are likely to be missed or consequences of decisions that I might not see. And so I am kind of leaning toward, even though I don't want to necessarily create extra committees, but I do kind of lead toward creating sort of an ad hoc committee that includes members of the community that might have some insight to this as well. And so I don't know if maybe I'm just making more work and more out of it than it's necessary. I certainly don't want to do that. I look at this and I go, yeah, this looks good. But I'm always worried about something that I didn't foresee that could become an issue, down the road. So that's my thought at this moment, which of course is not, I could be persuaded otherwise, but that's just my thought at this moment.
I agree with Kathy. You're right. Another committee that could actually just deal with that, I think would probably be the smarter way to go, just because, like you, I'm sure we wouldn't know all the pitfalls. And I raised our son here, and I mean, he was in athletics, but I certainly don't have the history that Kevin Murray does, on all the athletics and that, and I wouldn't pretend to. So yeah, I guess I agree with you. Having an ad hoc committee, I think, might just be the way to go. Thank you.
So, and not that I'm hanging on every word, right? So whether it's athletics, whether it's a component of the arts, right? Whether it's someone from a curricular standpoint, right? These are the challenges, right? And it's kind of like facility use, right? It becomes somewhat of a sticky wicket. I think if I may suggest, of similar to what we did with the Community Finance Advisory Committee relative to the referendum, right? So we really had that committee or that panel for 1 or 2 sessions, right? So administratively, there were ideas, right? We'll soon be onboarding a new athletic director. Certainly, we have 2 site athletic directors. And there's a financial component, there's a facilities component. I think administratively, are there some thoughts where we, again, this is what we do 24/7. Can we pull some framework together, but then engaging members of the community, similar to maybe what we did with the CFAC. Here's what we're thinking. What are your thoughts? What we're thinking is this is what districts are doing, whether it's Sun Prairie, whether it's Bigfoot, whether it's Appleton, and do we pull some of that together? Those waters have been navigated already. And again, the experience of, we'll say administratively, what we have around the table and kind of present that information, because what is it we want, our sponsorships to be or our naming to be. Right. And again, they can maybe be 2 different things, right? But that's kind of what we have to sort through because we have to be careful about naming, but then trying to get a sponsorship for that facility. All right. And so I'll give you Sun Prairie is a perfect example. So Bank of Sun Prairie is a sponsor on their new amazing stadium. All right. And one would think that there was a ton of money, right, put forward for that. And not so much, right? And I don't know if anyone from Sun Prairie is tuning into local cable access, right? But I want to say it was a 20-year commitment for about $250,000. Okay, correct. That's it. It was my response as well. All right. Now the field is named, right, as a long-standing field, from generations ago, right? And how do we, what is it? What are the components? Is it the field maybe we reserve? Is it the classroom we reserve? Is it the IMC for that beloved, librarian who was in the district for 35 years? What was it we wanted, right? And these are the waters that can be tenuous to navigate. So I think, do we pull things together? Sorry, long answer. I'll be quiet, right? But then we need that public input, but how do we frame that public input?
Just to make sure the people that are looking, CFAC, could you, what did that stand for?
So that was a Community Financial Advisory Committee.
Thank you. So I guess given that feedback, we will, I think it would be best to pull together what other districts have done and maybe flesh out some ideas with respect to that, and then look to see the aspects to representing the community to pull together, similar to the Finance Advisory Committee that came together, and this would be similarly done. I think that fits what we described as an ad hoc committee and not that many meetings to do that. So I think that would be the direction we would move in. So that was really what we were looking forward for this particular item. If there's nothing else. Next is update on the student transportation request for proposal.
So just real quick, as part of our RFP process, I believe we were targeting the first board meeting in May to have a recommendation. So there's a bit of a homework internally. All right. Wanted you to know that, finance will follow that. But I think for the sake of the contractor, right, we're on somewhat of an expeditious timeline versus waiting to that meeting in late May, right, which is just before June, right? So allow some time. So just want to give you a heads up that you'll see something on that May 12th board agenda.
Do we have a actual target for that, date-wise? Said before the May 12th So I was just curious, do we know when we would have it before then?
As an informational item, so we would target, and I may have misspoke. So essentially, there'd be a recommendation for on May 12th.
I have May 11th as a.
Oh. May 11th then. My bad. Thank you.
So then my question is how soon before May 11th would we be prepared to discuss it, even if we wanted to come back as a committee or whatever the finance committee is at that point, since this is technically our last.
I mean, we could
Committee
certainly
meeting.
schedule that. I would say off the top of my head, just a week prior, so the 4th.
All right, so just a consideration, not to say that we would do that, but okay. Okay, any further questions on that topic? Future committee items. Any? I can't think of any that I would really, and as I alluded to, or I basically said, this is the last committee meeting of the board year with our current board. So from the chair standpoint, thank you all for the participation as a committee. I think this was probably the best committee year, given all of the items we covered and the fidelity in which we really, Mr. McCrae went through some things and explained in great detail, but yet it seemed fairly simplistic to help us better understand school finance and various processes as we think of, really with the referendum and the lead up to that, and then the work that we've really done here within the committee. I just want to say thank you all. It's been, I can't remember what the PPC committee, the personnel policy curriculum, but I think riveting was the word that Commissioner Hayworth used for her committee. Well, I'm not sure we've ever had any riveting meetings, but we've had some definitely detailed and where the work is really getting done. That's the part I appreciate most about the committees, and thank you, Mr. McCrae, Mr. Leader, Mr. Farwell here, Tammy, and then the board members. Thank you all. And can never leave Patrick and Denise out because it makes us sound good and look good, and particularly when everything works well. So just want to say thank you. So the next item is a tour of Adams Elementary School cafeteria. Anything we want to mention before we get there, Mr. Leader, Mr. McCrae?
So when you last saw it, it was, I believe, studded out.
Yep.
And open ceilings and plywood on doors. So again, a shout out to Angus Young Architects, Gilbane Construction. We had a little follow up with EUA from an interior design standpoint. And I forget the name of our partner who you'll see from a graphic standpoint. So I hope they forgive me, but my guess is they're not listening to local cable access. So I know Dana Simmons, right? So Dave and I take the approach of engaging our building leaders, right? Things are not driven by the ESC and handed down. Certainly we maybe provide guardrails and parameters, but really getting feedback from Dana. Dana then really getting feedback from her staff, from a color scheme perspective, from a messaging perspective, and it's really a sharp looking space.
Okay. So we will adjourn our meeting from that location. So thank you.